Mayor de Blasio, welcome to Dad Saves America.
I love the name of this podcast. I'm happy to be here.
So let's just start off. Tell me your story. Like, who are you? Where do you come from?
Well, I come from my family. I mean, I think in the end, if you are truly, sincerely motivated to be in public life, it should come from your own personal experience, from your lived experience. So for me, it's family. My grandparents emigrated from southern Italy, from small towns. They absolutely lived the American dream. You know, they came to New York from towns that are as far away from the life of New York as you could possibly imagine. My grandparents, Giovanni and Anna. And, 2 generations later, their grandson is mayor of New York City. I mean, if that's not the American dream, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
So I have a very strong view on the question of immigration because the people I cherish, the people who made everything possible for us. My dad had a really strong, powerful set of experiences in his life, but some that were very difficult. He fought in World War II. He had, very sadly, very tragically, half his leg blown off on Okinawa at the very, very end of the war. Suffered physical disabilities, suffered mental health challenges, suffered ultimately from alcoholism. So a lot of the things that plague our society, that came right home. It was right there in our home. But unfortunately, it also led to our home breaking down. I had a lot of respect for my dad, and also I saw his suffering, and I saw the suffering that unfortunately he caused in a lot of other people because of everything he had been through. That, made me feel the fact that the decisions that are made affect all of us, the big decisions in the world. The decisions leaders make come home, to families and stick with them for generations. I had my oldest brother, Steve, was Vietnam draft age at a point where I think it would be fair to say a majority of Americans had come to the conclusion the Vietnam War was a mistake.
Yeah.
So we lived, I can remember very vividly being at the dining room table and worrying, would he live through the war? Would he be drafted? These things are very visceral, intense, personal. And, it all pulled me into a focus on the outside world and what I could do about it. And at a certain point, I think it really happened, in middle school and high school even. I came to a conclusion I had to be involved in the world around me. Nothing else could possibly make sense. And that's what I did.
I understand that your parents were both pretty intellectual, educated, and engaged in ideas and engaged in caring about the country. Tell me a little more about them, as you understand it, like leading into the war and what happened after, because I understand they also came into the spotlight after the war.
They did. And look, it's another American dream story because, I ended up, because of all the problems that happened in our family, and really because the Italian side of my family, my mom's side, brought me up. So I ultimately took her last name to honor them and to thank them. And I feel very, very connected to my Italian heritage. But I have my father's side too, which is a mix of Northern European backgrounds. But what's really interesting is his parents. His dad was from Defiance, Ohio, small town Ohio, or small city. His mom, a very small town in Iowa, Blanchard, Iowa is where she was born. She grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska. Why am I telling you this? Because their families really valued education. My grandmother's father decided to move to Lincoln, Nebraska so his daughters could get an education, which was a very enlightened view at the time. My paternal grandfather played football so he could ultimately get a college scholarship. So education ran through our family, and the same with my mom. My mom was, one of the first in her family to go to college, child of immigrants. No one had gone to college in the previous generation.
Yep.
So it really, families that got where they got through a lot of hard work and through a focus on education. But no one was born into privilege. Among my 4 grandparents, no one was born into privilege. All of them pretty humble beginnings. For my parents, they were both very intellectually gifted. They got fantastic educations. And they had me late in life. They were 44 when they had me, which was very unusual back then. They met actually right before the war at Time magazine. They were both working for an upstart new publication called Time magazine.
How about that? That's amazing.
Isn't that funny? We think about all the new media nowadays, and we think about all the, the things that keep popping up. But once upon a time, that was Time magazine. So they met there. And then my dad volunteered for the Army for officer training right after Pearl Harbor. which is a great example of who he was as a human being. He didn't wait to be drafted. He chose to serve. But my mom got very involved at Time magazine, and she believed in the labor movement, and she joined a union and ultimately was active in the union. And my mom was a liberal Democrat, by no means anything more intense than that. But some of the people back then in the 1940s in that union happened to be farther left wing, including some who identified as communists. That came back in the 1950s to haunt both my parents. They were investigated, even though they had absolutely no connection to communism or Marxism or anything like that. And I think it's a really interesting comment on what happens when democracy degenerates, because the McCarthy era, to me, is even more powerful than some of the things people worry about now. Both my parents, loyal Americans, both worked in the war effort. My mom worked for the Office of War Information on broadcast to Italy during the war. So both parents deeply involved in the war effort. My dad gave half his leg for his country, and captain in the U.S. Army, and they both got investigated because they were in the room with people who happened to be communists. They didn't share their views. And it was very, very difficult. My mom was a very pragmatic person, and somehow I think she navigated it, and she had a certain good Italian skepticism of government, shall we say. So she didn't take it too personally. My dad was really deeply affected. And he was, at the time of these investigations, he was actually working in the Truman administration, kind of mid-level role, but he had his security clearance revoked for a period of time while he was being investigated. And he said this, I mentioned a variation of what he said. He literally said at some family meal one time, and it was passed on for generations. He said, I gave my leg for my country. What else do they want from me? And it was very, very difficult to think about a guy who, everything you could want from a citizen, and yet he was questioned for something he never did. And that I think had a real big impact on his mental health as well. I think it was very destabilizing for him.
How did that impact the way you understood the country at the time? Because that's got to be a very difficult thing as a young man. Maybe this happened before you were even old enough for it to matter, but in reflecting on it, when you came to understand this, how did it impact you?
Yeah, I mean, I came to understand it, more than 20 years later, but I saw the results. I saw that it was one of the contributing factors to his decline. And again, a lot of factors go into what happens to someone. Just the amount of death he saw in Okinawa alone, which is one of the bloodiest battles in human history. I mean, if that's not enough to give someone a mental health challenge, I don't know what is. Certainly, by today's terms, we would say this was someone with PTSD. Back then, they didn't say that, and they didn't know how to address the mental health challenges.
Yeah.
But my point is, I saw the results. When I was a teenager, I saw him as someone, unfortunately, who really couldn't function and was deep in alcoholism and crisis. And I felt horrible for him. And I also was angry at the ways that had hurt him, but also hurt everyone around him. When I fully started to understand that that was a piece of it, that the McCarthy era was a piece of it, it certainly affected my worldview, because the notion that people who were extraordinarily loyal to their country, who were expressing their values, but values absolutely consistent with the mainstream and the idea that everyone is supposed to participate and do something for their fellow American. Like these two were the epitome of that, and to see what they went through, largely because of an ideological game or an ideological, power play by Joe McCarthy and others, that woke me up to a lot of the realities of the world, a lot of the realities of politics, and it certainly made me very, very clear on how much we all have to participate in protecting our rights. So to me, I think it all added up to say, this is not a spectator sport, right? This is like, if you see all of these things I've talked about affect your own family and more, you have to be involved. And also for me, there was a kind of never again feeling about the McCarthy era, that we could never let something like that happen again in this country.
I understand that you will sometimes give speeches in Italian, so you're a fluent Italian speaker.
No, I would never claim to be fluent.
So how are you pulling this off?
I don't give speeches. What I do is, I have studied Italian for years. I studied Italian intensely when I was a student at New York University. But here's the trick, and you'll appreciate it. right at the end of NYU, I was right there in Greenwich Village. Right at the end of my time at NYU, a girlfriend I was with back then told me I should go get a haircut at this really cheap barbershop nearby called Astor Hairstylist. I've been going there ever since. A lot of the barbers were Italian. So I found this barber, Mario, fantastic guy from near Naples. And we had a deal that went on for literally a couple of decades that we could only speak Italian in the barber's chair. And so I had practice every few weeks and kept it going. And I've visited Italy many times. I've been to my grandparents' hometowns, which I'm very proud of. So I can have a conversation. I can do pieces of a speech. I can do interviews sometimes, but I would never claim to be fluent.
Okay, very good. Have you seen the movie Cabrini yet?
No, I hear it's great. Tell me.
So I think you will. I hope that you'll get to see it and we can have a conversation after, because to me, the thing that's so powerful about it as an Italian American and for you as a New Yorker is it shines a light on the experience of the Italian Americans coming into New York, into 5 Points, and the way we were talked to.
Yes.
Which I grew up hearing these things from my grandmother, and I experienced a tiny bit of it, a tiny bit of like genuine like discrimination, just a little. I'm not trying to say I had any kind of oppression. We were called Latins and brown, and then I looked at my naturalization papers from my great-grandfather, and it's like dark-skinned. And did you have any of that experience growing up? Did you hear about that from your mother?
Oh, absolutely. My mom and her sisters all spoke Italian and dialect before they ever spoke English. And then, in fact, our family went back to Italy with the intention of staying and then returned to America. So our family is very deeply connected to Italy. And my aunt, who passed away just a few years ago, her name was Yola, and she told me very poignantly, just a few years ago before she passed, she said she would go to school and kids would make fun of her, and she'd come home, and my grandfather would always tell her to focus on her pride. He used the word fieri. And he would remind her of what Italians had done for the world and how much of today's life and civilization came from the Italian people all over the world. That this was so essential, so that people were making fun of you, they didn't understand that,
Yes.
and to just focus on your pride. So that's just one generation before.
Yeah.
I'm blessed I did not, but no, it's not far away. And it was very severe. And I'm also someone who resents still to this day the stereotyping that you see in too much of media and too much of entertainment, where, there's 15 or 20 million Italian Americans, and still the first thing a lot of people think about is organized crime. And that's a horrible disservice.
It's very interesting because there's now been, you are one of many Italian-American mayors of New York City, but when you go back to that point, Italians, I think at that time, we were the largest immigrant group to the U.S.
Yeah.
And I think there were millions of Southern Italians were coming. And the parallels, this is maybe an area where you and I are probably closer to each other than on other things. The parallels between the Italian-American experience at the turn of the century and the Mexican-American experience today, I think they shine through in that movie. So that's why I'm excited to hear your thoughts on it.
I definitely want to see it. And I think it's powerful that you're saying that, because one of the things I hope people can learn over time is that pretty much everyone's been through one version or another of that kind of discrimination. Lord knows the Irish went through it in the 1800s, horrible discrimination. The Germans, we had German Americans who were loyal Americans and were still treated as a suspect around World War I. Unfortunately, there's a long history of first rejecting people and then eventually accepting them. And I get it, but I don't get it, meaning it's morally wrong. I understand the way history and society and culture have created a notion of who's the other. But what I hate is we go through the same pattern over and over again. And then people become part of America and they contribute to America. And then at some point we stop treating them like the other. And I just wish we could cut out that whole long middle and recognize that everyone belongs.
I think that it's inevitable in a certain sense, right? Because we are still an animal. We evolved in groups and we are groupish creatures. So we see someone different. They've got different smelling food. They've got some funny accent. I mean, as fellow paisanos, it's like you go to Italy and they're barely a country as it is. They were the last country in Europe
Exactly.
to unify. So, you know, Naples has a very particular accent and people make fun of each other. I mean, how do you think about the sort of inherent, that part of human nature that I think we all have, that tribal nature? How do you think about that when you think about identity?
I think you're exactly right that it's inherent. I don't know if it's forever. I think it's an interesting question where we're going in a world that's kind of in some ways homogenizing more, but I think you're right that our history has been that, and that people, in a funny way, we love to identify and categorize and choose up sides. You know, you know from your knowledge of New York, people are fiercely proud of their neighborhoods.
Yes.
And, you know, it used to be, you have to go back to West Side Story and all the history that reflected, but unfortunately, even to the date, you know, young people are in gangs, you know, one based on living in one housing development, the other in the next housing development, and somehow they've got a beef between them, even though they live, you know, 4 blocks apart. Human beings do have this ability to choose sides and find division even where it may not exist. So this is a bigger human problem. But a lot of that has been exacerbated by government and by media and other forces that, you know, didn't take the opportunity to show the human commonality. And I think that's changing. I think some of that's changing, but that's a real issue. Some of that division or some of that misunderstanding or tribalism was aided and abetted.
Help me understand, you know, I'm a politically minded person. I've paid attention to you in the public sphere, so I know I know your positions that have been out there in the public, but help me understand with fresh ears what you believe and why.
Well, the amazing thing in our political discourse is how much we all miss each other and, you know, don't understand each other. Because in the end, I feel like the things I focus on really come from my family experience, both the family I was born into and then the family I'm blessed to have helped to create. And, you know, I'll give you some definitional words, but I just want to come into it this way. The achievement I'm proudest of as mayor is pre-K for all. And pre-K for all was really motivated by what I saw with my own kids and the challenges we had trying to find good opportunities for them when they were really little. And I heard the same from so many parents. Well, that led me to ask a lot of questions and think about a different way of doing things. And now I'm happy to say New York City has universal pre-K for free for all its children. To me, it's a version of family values, but it's a progressive one. I see the world through a family lens. It's the most important thing to me. It's the most important thing I ever did in my life was to have the family that I had. But also, as you were hearing, everything that shaped me and influenced me, I absolutely credit to my family and my grandfather in particular, Giovanni, my mom, whose name was Maria. She had an incredible impact on me. My brothers, you know, I see the world through that lens. So philosophically, I'm a progressive, and I really harken back to, you know, 100 plus years ago, the progressive era in the United States, which was about supporting working people, you know, folks who worked in factories and farms and small business people and taking on big corporations. That's the origin of a lot of my values, the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt and what Fiorello LaGuardia did in New York City. Big part of what shaped my worldview, and my family very much gave that to me. I often said at family gatherings, they talked so much about Franklin Roosevelt and Fiorello LaGuardia that felt like there were 2 extra chairs at the table because you could just feel their presence. So that's my worldview. And look, I see myself progressive in terms of other parts of the world. Like I think in Western Europe, you'd say a social democrat. I have a lot of affinity for a lot of what Bernie Sanders has done here in this country. But I think, and Bernie's a really great example, I've gotten to know him, you know, he's a working class guy from Brooklyn, went to public schools. His worldview is very much about working people from his own family's perspective. I like a non-elitist, grounded type of progressivism that focuses on the needs of working people. And I'm the first to say I'm a Democrat, but I have plenty to say about how I think the Democratic Party at times has strayed from that core identity and gotten lost in certain types of elitism that don't really reflect what I value.
The progressive movement, and I've done some other videos on our YouTube channel about this, it seems like it has two threads in it. And I want to hear how you think about this, because there's a populism, there's a William Jennings Bryant energy that's about whether it's farmers for him or working people in general. And then there's this other piece of it, which I would say is the Wilsonian piece of it from my perspective, which is a sort of Princeton elite. Eugenics is part of that too. There's this sort of planner, designer, we know better, we can design a better society, we can straighten the crooked arrow of man part, which is the part of progressivism, frankly, that I don't like very much. And so how do you think about those things? Do you think that's a fair characterization of some of the threads that are at play? And
well, I think it can. You're first of all, I give you credit for knowing and understanding that history, because very, very few people do nowadays. I think you're right to say that that kind of split between a more grassroots orientation and a more elite orientation goes back well over 100 years. And I do agree with you that some of the impulse of the more elite side did have a certain social engineering element to it. That was very much a double-edged sword.
yes,
You know, I mean, to put it in international terms, like I appreciate that Wilson wanted to do the League of Nations. It also proved to be disastrous on many levels, but the underlying idea was not necessarily a bad idea. But I think the politics and the representation of the needs of everyday people, of working people, kitchen table level, you know, just basics. Do people have enough to eat? Do they have, you know, good pay and benefits? Do they have good health care? Are their kids going to do as well as them or better? I mean, that to me is where the progressive movement did reside in its best days and should reside again, and the same for the Democratic Party, obviously. So I think it's fair to say that those tensions go back a long way. They've taken different forms over time. But to me, it's not complicated. I mean, you know, I look at what the people tell us year in and year out through elections, and it's so clear that they want to see government do something that reaches their everyday life in a very tangible way. And this is where I think Pre-K for All, for me, was a very powerful example. There are people who absolutely disagree with me, but they still believe in that achievement, and they know what it meant for them and their families and their neighborhoods. Like, this is the kind of thing government should do. Like, how do we lighten people's burden? How do we put money back in the pockets of people who have been, you know, working really hard but struggling to get by? That's the politics that I think should be the essence. It doesn't mean there aren't other things to think about. Like, there are some real profound challenges where we have to say, hey, what are we going to do to try and address this going forward? Climate, you know, is a great example of that. You know, what people want every day on climate, they want low gas prices, for example, who can blame them, is not necessarily what's good for their future or their children or grandchildren's future. That's an understandable tension. So, you know, I wouldn't call it social engineering to say we have to figure out solutions to climate, even if they're not always immediately appealing. That you could also just call that policy. But I do think that the discussion has to start with people's tangible needs, not, you know, some academic exercise, but really, what are people going through and what do they need right now?
you did not, you called yourself more of a social democrat. Bernie Sanders has called himself a democratic socialist. What's your understanding of what capitalism is and socialism is, and you know, and this battle of ideas? Where does that land for you?
Yeah, look, I think it's quite clear we're in a capitalist society that has some very positive elements to it and some very negative elements to it. And I think, and this is sort of consistent with the New Deal worldview, the role of government is to support people and protect people from the negative realities of capitalism and to create some checks and balances, create some regulation. Don't let capitalism be without some balancing factors. Socialism, you know, the experiences we've seen of pure, what we might call pure socialism, obviously have been very far from what I think the theorists thought they'd be, and often have not involved a democratic approach, and I believe in democracy profoundly. What I appreciate in the socialist impulse is people saying, how do we, you know, create as much equality and fairness and opportunity as possible? I think that does run through that worldview. But the reason I like social democracy is I think it combines all these thoughts in an appropriate way. We're in a capitalist society. We've got to address some of the problems and excesses of capitalism. We've got to maximize opportunity and fairness. Government can play a very meaningful role in doing that. We have great examples from around the world today and many from the past, including in this country. And I think striking that balance is actually what most people want. I mean, my experience of talking to people over the country, but looking at the opinion research, looking at how people vote, is I actually think they want that kind of balance point. They don't want big corporations running wild, nor are people saying, oh, I trust the government to take care of everything. You know, I think most Americans don't trust either side of that coin.
That's definitely
They
true.
want some balance, some moderation, some checks and balances. So you might be more conservative, you might be more progressive, but I think that's where most people are residing.
What's your definition of capitalism? I'm curious.
I don't have a perfect definition. I think capitalism is obviously a system based on maximizing individual wealth and profit. And again, I'm the first to say objectively, I don't see capitalism with rose-colored glasses, but I can say objectively, look, a lot of people have gained a quality of life, a standard of living that's very favorable in a capitalist system. And there is a strong correlation to democratic rights and freedoms. I appreciate it. I also have seen the capitalist system wreak a lot of havoc and a lot of unnecessary havoc. So this is where a pure, like a capitalist system without some real counterbalance is extremely problematic to me, because then it becomes dog eat dog. A system based on individual profit and the maximization of wealth is going to have a lot of losers unless you put some mediating elements into that.
I tend to see it not about profit per se, but about voluntary exchange and association. That the rules of capitalism are basically private property and adult consent. That consenting adults can more or less engage in whatever contract they see fit, so long as they're not defrauding anyone or stealing anything. And that's basically the operating system of capitalism. And that can give rise to all kinds of other things like corporations or nonprofits, but that it's essentially, you know, adults consensually contracting and exchanging with each other. And yes, a lot of times there's profit. You kind of need profit to keep going, but most of the business people I meet actually tend not to be motivated by profit first and foremost. They tend to be passion driven. Some people are super motivated by profit, but profit's not really the North Star. It's exchange. I mean, what do you think of that definition?
I think there's obviously pieces of what you said that I think are very valid, but I don't think that's the whole story. I think when you say, you know, except for fraud and illegality and all, let's recognize that unfortunately, there is a lot of fraud and illegality running through that system, and a lot of it people get away with. I mean, tax evasion and, you know, the companies that have polluted in a very dangerous and incredibly insensitive way and got away with it for a long time. I mean, this is not. If you were to say a pure argument that, hey, let's imagine a small town and everyone sort of starts at the same starting line, and there's a bunch of farmers and small business people and whatever, and they decide what they're going to exchange and what they're going to, you know, someone wants to open a store, someone wants to grow corn. Okay, I get that. But the problem is, in a massified world, in a globalized world, like what we find really happens is exploitative capitalism. It's not the only model. I'm not saying, you know, there's only one thing. I'm saying the bigger it gets, it often correlates to being exploitative and so profit-focused as to do destructive things. So I think one thing that's become clear is this is the system we're going to be working with for a long time. Just like I hope and pray representative democracy is a system we're going to be working with for a long time. But we got a lot of work to do to make it serve people better. And I love the notion of the freedom, both because of democracy and the good elements of capitalism, the freedom, you know, study what you want to study, get the kind of job you want to get. You know, if you want to start a business, you could start wherever you want, see how far you could take it. These are really good things. But I also want to be clear-eyed about the fact that a lot of people are excluded from that equation because education and opportunity are far from equally distributed. And we've got a long way to go to really make that a more open door and a more level playing field. And that doesn't mean like forcing everyone to be exactly the same. It does mean really fostering opportunity, because right now, there's a lot of people being left out. And we talked about our ancestors.
Yeah.
A lot of our ancestors were left out for a long time. You know, we're proud of, I mean, our families obviously were blessed enough to get some opportunity that gave us what we have now. And here you and I are talking to each other because opportunity did work for our families.
Yes.
I know plenty of Italian-American families who haven't progressed a whole lot over the generations and are still struggling. So my vision is, how do you maximize fairness and opportunity?
I understand you honeymooned in Cuba. Is that right? Am I getting that right?
You are getting that right.
Why did you do that when you did it? And were you more radical when you were younger and you've become more moderate? Because the conversation we've had is a pretty moderated conversation. So I want to understand your evolution philosophically. And honestly, I'm not trying to be like, you're a damn commie. That's not what I'm here to do. But I'm very curious about your path, because this is a unique opportunity. It's hard, frankly, to get people from different perspectives to come and have a conversation like this.
Well, you're gracious for not calling me damn anything, so thank you. It's a good start. But no, look, I feel like I have been a progressive and a social democrat, and again, a New Dealer who was just happened to be born a few generations later. You know, I feel like I've been that my whole life. I appreciate all of the examples around the world of where people overthrew dictatorships. And then there are some examples, you know, we overthrew a dictatorship, obviously, as Americans. You know, the king is another version of a dictator, right? We overthrew a dictatorship. There's examples where, as in the best of the American experience, that led to something very good. There's also examples that weren't so good, and a lot of mixes in between. From my point of view, the original impulse of the Cuban Revolution to get rid of a brutal dictator was a good thing. And there were elements of what the Cuban government after the revolution did, particularly in areas like healthcare and education, that were also good things. There were definitely other elements that were not good at all. The lack of freedom and political freedom and free expression has been a problem for decades. But I did appreciate the good part of that history, and I was very interested in what happened there and why it happened, and honestly very frustrated with this country, because I love my country, but for 60 years we had a chance to bring Cuba into our orbit, and we consistently turned away, and often in a way that was, you know, just intensified the inability to get that country and its people on our side. And that always, to me, was a massive mistake. So I wanted to experience it because it, you know, for me, it was sort of something I grew up with and is always around as an issue. I wanted to actually go there rather than only be able to hear about it from afar. But I didn't go there uncritically, and I don't have an uncritical view of them now. I do feel very strongly that the world was shaped in many ways by anti-colonial struggles, starting with the one that happened in the United States of America in 1775. You know, I grew up, you probably know this, I grew up, my family's from New York, but I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and when you go, the park right in the middle of Cambridge, Mass., the Cambridge Common, there's like, to this day, cannons from the American Revolution right there, outdoors, like right there in the park. You can feel the presence of the fact that we were a revolutionary country that threw off a dictator, threw off a colonial power. That happened in the post-World War II era all over the world and shaped today's world. So I think respecting the fact that that impulse was meaningful is different from being happy with everything that happened thereafter.
I think it's a great tragedy of our education system that the Cold War is frankly barely taught, but also that when you even come across it at all, it's a cartoon character. Now, I think communism is a disaster. I think that's objective. You've said it yourself. I think we did have these two powers that were playing proxy wars all around the world to some pretty heinous effects. You and I probably would find common cause on some of these things. I think like the US's involvement in places like Iran in the 50s with the overthrow of Mohammed Mossadegh in the name of basically British Petroleum, what's currently called British Petroleum, is astonishingly awful and probably
Yep.
shaped the present Middle East more profoundly than just about anything else that's happened. Like, would we have the Ayatollah
Exactly.
if it hadn't been for that? Probably not. Um, I think the sanctions on Cuba. I've as my adult life, I have been in opposition of that. It doesn't work. It just keeps the dictators in power while impoverishing the people, and it turns us into the enemy. It seems idiotic. We probably agree on that.
We do agree on that.
How?
See, we may agree on more than you realize.
No, it's good. Well, I think we do. But I think I know we profoundly disagree probably on a lot of things. But I'm curious, where have you encountered the most serious challenge to your own impulses and worldviews? Like, where have you encountered an argument that made you stop and say, I maybe am wrong on that?
Look, I question all the time. And I'm very comfortable with that. I question decisions I make. I question whether a vision that I have is actually going to work the way I hope it does, or if it's something I'm able to put into action. You know, I don't look at it and say, "Oh, we're so perfect." And I've had plenty of missteps along the way. I think in terms of broader philosophy, this conversation tracks, you know, the running tension that I have felt. As you were talking about, for example, the problems of socialism and communism, I agree with you. I also think it's fair to say, because there was another set of values out there, it did have an impact on the capitalist system. For example, certainly in much of Europe, where you have, you know, healthcare systems that are more universal, and you have a lot of benefits for workers and pensions and one thing or another, that's directly because there was a counter view out there in the world that was gaining traction, and a lot of governments and a lot of the business sector realized they had to make concession. So, you know, the reason I say that to you is I've watched that trajectory and appreciated that kind of give and take, as it were. But I've also seen that a lot of the people that I hoped would be benevolent rulers were not at all. You know, I was proud to be involved in a small, humble way in efforts to support the Nicaraguan government after the Sandinista revolution. That was also the overthrow of a dictator, also, unfortunately, a US-backed dictator who had done horrendous, violent things to his own people. And that was a broad-based revolution. And you know what? I was involved, and I was proud to be involved. I was involved in efforts to help make sure the United States did not militarily intervene, which I'm very happy about, especially post-Vietnam, that we learned our lesson. And that first Sandinista government actually left office, peaceful transfer of power, when they lost an election, which was a really good sign to the world that you could have progressive values and have a vision that was something other than just capitalism, but also recognize true democratic norms. But now, more recently, you know, the same person, Daniel Ortega, has turned into just another dictator. And it's horrible. So, you know, trying to understand why does that happen? Why does a person and a movement that actually did something not perfect at all, but that had some actual meaning because they did give up power, like the ultimate test of, are you committed to democracy? What went wrong to turn them into what they are today? You know, and I'm not happy about what they are today. So I'm constantly trying to look at all these examples and discern, you know, what does it mean? How do we think about them? How do we somehow help the world not make those mistakes in the future?
What do you make of, there are polls showing that 28% of Gen Z has a favorable view, I think this is from either Pew or YouGov, of the word communism. What do you make of that?
Well, I don't know. I haven't seen that. I'd like to see more of what it tells us. I mean, I remember when Bernie Sanders ran, we saw some of the first research that said millennials had a deeper critique of capitalism and were more open to the idea of socialism. What I took from that was not necessarily that people were into the kind of definitional conversation you and I are having. What I took from it was that folks were feeling their prospects were pretty limited, that they were not responding to big ideological sweeping ideas. They were responding to life as it's lived. And, you know, I want to tell you, I saw something that really captured it for me. I was out in Michigan. I'm teaching out there at the University of Michigan, and I went to an event for the likely U.S. Senate candidate for the Democrats, Congress member Elisa Slotkin, former CIA officer, moderate Democrat, very interesting person. But she gave a kind of synopsis of what the typical Michigan working class family used to expect, let's say, 30, 40 years ago, versus what they expect today. And it was very powerful, and I think the simplest way to say it was she said, people expected, not only would they make ends meet, but they could have some comfort. They could own a home, they could have a car, they could, maybe have a little cabin, in the country by a lake, go there in the summer. And of course they expected their kids would do not only as well, but their kids would probably get more education. A typical Michigan family, a lot of them were auto workers, or worked in industry. They worked really hard, long hours, so their kids could get an education and even do better. And now, the typical view of so many working class and middle class people is they're hanging on by a thread themselves, and they're scared to death that the next generation is not only not going to do better, might even do worse, or is already doing worse. So the reason I say that is I think for a lot of those respondents, they are that generation that feels they are doing worse. Whether it's a ton of college loan debt or other debt, or whether it is that they can't find a job that actually allows them to think about having a house or a family. A lot of things have changed. So I think there is a sense for a lot of folks, say, under 40, that the system they grew up with isn't keeping that promise anymore. And I think some of them say, okay, that's capitalism, and then we want to talk about alternatives, and they listen to some of the things that Bernie talks about, and they find it appealing, for example. And I believe that's actually a healthy discussion, because it's true that the current system is laying people down. It's not just because of capitalism, it's also because of a lot of decisions of government. There's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, we don't have a free market. We have a very mixed economy.
Well, and I was someone who believes in a certain amount of mix, but I'm trying to be objective and say there's no one place that gets blame here.
Yeah.
But what we can say is,
I agree with that.
What we absolutely can say is the current generations are scared to death about their futures. So they are now questioning the whole system of things.
Let's talk about that next generation. So you have a really neat family. And you have brought your family into the political domain, right? So your son. It's funny. I thought about naming my son Dante. So I saw your son's name.
Did you really?
Yeah, I saw your son's name.
Such a great. What was your decision?
Mateo.
Mateo's a good name.
So and it's actually his middle name because being kind of old school, I was like, no, you got to have my name, but we'll make it your middle name, but we'll call you your middle name. So technically he's John Popola or John Mateo Popola, but he only ever goes by Mateo. So
I like it. Dante is such an amazing name, and people love this name, but Mateo's a good one too. You chose well.
My wife chose. My wife came to me with this one, and I was like, oh, you did it. You won. That's amazing.
You have to know when to concede, brother.
You have a mixed house. Your wife is black. Your kids are mixed race. You have said that you said in a public debate on stage, I believe, that you have. I want to actually pull up the exact quote. I don't want to misquote you, but that you raised a black son in America. That is a part of your understanding of this country and the world. Talk to me about that. Talk to me about why you would, first of all, why would you say that? What does that mean? What is the lesson there? What is the lesson you've learned from your family about America, about race?
Well, I mean, thankfully, the lesson I learned from my family is that, we're all in this together. So when I became an adult and I started dating different women, I didn't think about, who am I supposed to date, who am I not supposed to date according to ethnicity or anything. I just dated the people I liked, and had for years and years that happened to be women who were of European background. And then one day, Charlene walked up to me when I was working in City Hall in New York City, and the rest is history. I like to say, and you'll appreciate it, that she walked up to me and I saw her coming toward me, and I was immediately struck. And I like to say I heard violins, I heard the angels sing, and she felt absolutely nothing. So it was like love, it was one-sided love at first sight. But look, I mean, Dante's such an interesting person because he is so proud of all of his heritage. And, you know, he was in college. He spent a summer at the University of Siena because he wanted to learn Italian and delve into his Italian heritage. Obviously, with a name like Dante de Blasio, you know, it kind of
Siena's a great town.
You know, and so he is an example of someone who is a proud American, who's proud of being of Italian heritage, who's proud of being of African heritage as well. And we explicitly helped him to know about his heritage. Part of Charlene's family is from Barbados. We went there to expose him to that. They have elements of their history that suggest where they come from in West Africa. We went to West Africa. We've really tried to expose both our kids to this richness that makes up who they are. In our life together as a family, we did everything together. You know, Charlene had been someone who was very active on social issues. The kids were always interested. Long before anyone ever heard of me, we were always doing everything together. If I went out campaigning, they came with me. If I was doing a community event, they came with me. And then came the mayoral campaign, and I was way back in the pack most of the time. And we would do stuff together, and no one particularly cared. And then suddenly I started to gain traction, and we did one ad that featured Dante. And and it was very, you know, it was so much about his own personality and intelligence that came through that made that ad work. So it was a very unusual circumstance. And as you can probably imagine, you're doing something like that, you don't expect it necessarily to suddenly have the impact it did, and suddenly I was a front runner, and here we are. But the reason I say that is that the family being in public life, I don't think I ever understood what would happen and how much would happen and how big a deal it would become. And I think there's, you know, positives and negatives to that reality. But the part about talking about the parenting experience really came up because, you know, when I ran for mayor, I talked about the issue of stop and frisk, and that my predecessor, Michael Bloomberg, had very, very aggressively used that tactic. I thought it was creating tremendous problems between police and community. I thought it was a misuse of the tactic. By the way, my first police commissioner, Bill Bratton, absolutely agreed it was a misuse of the tactic and was my partner in changing that policy. And, you know, a great, great police leader. We had an incredible partnership. But we talked about very openly the fact that if police were seen as invading the personal space of young people who hadn't done anything wrong, that was not a good equation for the long term in terms of how police would be perceived by the young people, and also vice versa. I tried to talk very openly to the millions of constituents I had who had literally gone through the process of preparing their young people, particularly their young men, for how to comport themselves. And I had to go through that process too. And I grew up, you know, a white kid. I never thought twice about how I was going to be encountering a police officer. I had very few interactions with police officers except for in, you know, relatively normal or positive situations. But then I had to think about, how do you prepare a young person? And this kid was as good a kid as you could possibly imagine, studious and hardworking and just a wonderful human being. But unfortunately, in the reality of our society, the statistics showed it, you know, in that stop and frisk era, there was a very strong likelihood he would get stopped at some point, even if he hadn't done anything. And how you have to prepare a young person to not be misunderstood, to be extremely deferential, to not make any sudden moves, all these things, which I never had to be taught, bluntly, but he had to be taught. And I had millions of constituents who had gone through that process and felt it. And I was trying to tell them that I understood, and I was trying to do something about it. I also have a ton of respect for what police officers do. And I feel fundamentally that until we help police officers understand the people they serve better and the people they serve understand the officers better and create more sense of common ground and dialogue, we're going to have problems on the ground. It's going to stop us from fighting crime as well as we need to, but it's also going to lead to still, we still see too many of these tragedies that then just create more division. So I thought honesty was the best policy. Obviously, some people took exception.
Your son is a champion debater.
Yes.
And I understand, and you were on the debate stage in the early days of your presidential run. What's your relationship with each other and with debate?
Well, I want to say he's a better debater than me. He was a New York State debate champion, and I was a failed presidential candidate. So I think he did better. No, you'll appreciate this. My son is unquestionably smarter than me, and I think that's a victory for any parent.
Yes.
I'm like, congratulations, me. He's smarter. And I think my wife would say the same. So. Dante went to Brooklyn Technical High School, Brooklyn Tech, and it's just one of the biggest, literally physically in terms of number of students, one of the biggest high schools in America. And it's every kind of kid, and it's Brooklyn, it is a intense place, and people come from the grassroots and lots of immigrant kids. And Dante didn't walk in the door thinking, I want to be a debater, but he comes into this massive school and he's trying to figure out where does he belong and how does he fit in? And he found people in the debate team and they said, come and join us. And lo and behold, he got into it. And it turned out to be a very dedicated debater. He loved it. He learned a lot from it. He went to tournaments all over the state, all over the country. Great experience for him. Great experience humanly as well as intellectually. And he's an incredibly objective person. I mean, Dante's the first to point out any hole or contradiction in anything I say, whether it's, in the family or, something about the world. You don't want to be around him if you want to feel good about how perfect your argument is, because he will find he'll find the hole in it. He's really good at that. But anyway, I had an amazing experience as a parent, seeing how debate nurtured him and deepened his skills, his confidence. Amazing and positive experience. And so, look, I enjoyed and appreciated debate when I was a candidate. I realized every single time how I could do better, and I wished, I'd had more time to work on it. But debate in all its forms, it's so dynamic, and it really makes you think. And the truth comes out a lot in debate. This is the other thing. Unlike all the other sort of very ritualized elements of our political system, a lot of truth comes out in debates. Candidates are prepared and carefully, trained not to make a mistake, and yet, inevitably, a lot of truth comes out.
Why is debate important in the broader sense? Why is it important that you and I, who can profoundly disagree on some things that we won't convince each other of probably, no matter how much time we spend together, and that's okay. Why is it important that we be able to do that?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think there is such thing as, we're not learning from the experience. I mean, I think this is a sort of big overview point that needs to be recognized. Even with the what is the famous Mark Twain thing? Rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated. We're told that we're this horrible, polarized country that's beyond repair, and that's just totally inaccurate. We're going through a spell here. There are some particular tensions, but most people are not closed-minded. Most people are not so deeply political and ideological that they can't learn and grow, and most people are learning and growing from their daily experiences. I think the process of debate always is a way to reach people in that more open-minded place, which most people have some of. I have never been in a situation that I can remember where if I heard an opponent say something that I thought was better than what I was saying, that I just ignored it. I remember one debate when I ran for public advocate in particular, where one of my opponents questioned something I had done, 5 or 10 years earlier, and he said, that was wrong. And I said, I think you're right. Upon reflection, I think you're right. I think I made a mistake there. And he was totally flummoxed. He didn't know what to do with that. But I was listening. And we all should be listening and evolving. So I do think the process of debate is because a lot of people are listening and thinking and evaluating. It's never over. It's also about helping us think about, are we best articulating our values? And a lot of times we aren't. I mean, a whole lot of communication, particularly in the political realm, is really underwhelming and incomplete and unclear. So what I love about debate is it's a chance to actually keep working on, are you saying what you're trying to say? Are you actually putting your best foot forward and helping people to feel the idea you're trying to portray? And that often takes a lot of practice to get right. You know, you could love Joe Biden or you could not love Joe Biden, but what he did in the recent State of the Union, 2024, was entirely different than what we had seen in a year or two before. So I don't know how that happened, but it's a whole different presentation. It was a lot clearer. So I do think the process of working on your ideas and honing them and letting them be challenged and then responding to those challenges, I think that's part of what makes democracy work.
Your parents experienced McCarthyism. We talked about this at the beginning of the conversation. 80% of college students in one poll, and the FIRE organization spends a lot of time working on this. So this is not, I think this is pretty broadly representative. Say they feel they have to self-censor on college campuses. And it seems that debate in high school has started to adopt this norm. Do you see that happening? What do you make of this self-censorship, which does feel very connected to identity politics? And we used to say political correctness. That's like an old school term now, but that is what's happening. I don't feel I can say what I believe because, let's just say, frankly, it's more right of center, and I'm in this university, and I'm going to be called a racist if I say that. So I'm just going to shut up. What do you make of that?
I think it's a two-way street. I think we should be honest about the fact that it's happening on all sides of the spectrum. It's happening with people of all different ethnicities. It's not because of just one phenomenon. In other words, you could say, well, it's political correctness or wokeness or whatever. I could also say, well, I think the reality of Trumpism has played into this intensely as well, where people worry about the kind of reaction they may get, and they've seen more extreme reactions than what were previously deemed acceptable. I mean, certain extremity has been normalized during the Trump era. So I think it's everything. I hope some wisdom is setting in after all these years in my life. I don't need to ascribe it to one side or the other. I think it's everything. But I also think what that means is everyone's on pins and needles. I would love for people to sort of take a few steps back and say, let's agree that everyone's going to get to express their views. It's okay to listen to these other views. Like, the whole cancel culture goes both ways, by the way. It's like, why don't we stop canceling? Why don't we just start listening to the different views and then go do the thing that we're supposed to do and go to the people and try and win elections and, win the majority. I don't fear more conservative views. Look, if something is blatantly violent or blatantly racist or something like that, of course that has to be confronted, but not if someone has, say, a more traditional view versus a more modern or progressive view. That's fine. So I would argue we want to actually deeply diversify our college campuses in every sense. I believe in diversity and equity and inclusion initiatives, absolutely. I also believe that folks who feel politically marginalized should be welcomed and encouraged and told that their views are valued. And I don't like, booing people down and telling that people can't speak and all that. I want, to the maximum extent possible, to let all voices in. Now, again, if you say, well, I want to bring in a voice who's going to be blatantly anti-Semitic or Islamophobic or call for violence, no, that's a different matter. And I understand those sensitivities. They should be sensitive on college campuses. But the vast majority of voices are never close to that. If people want to debate the Middle East, The vast majority of people who are going to have that debate are not going to do it from a position that is inherently anti-Semitic or inherently Islamophobic. Most people are going to talk about, we have two people in conflict here, how do we resolve it? That's a good conversation.
Why is free speech, which is below the surface of debate, why is that so important to a free society, the democratic process? You know, what's your case for free speech?
Look, first of all, it's who we are. I mean, it's been now a quarter of a millennium that this republic has stood. And one of its most foundational ideas was freedom of speech. And again, that came from the experience of not having been allowed freedom of speech. I get that people are not going to, know their American revolutionary history, but I think sometimes it gets really elemental. We are a people that came from a situation where we were not allowed to speak freely. And when we threw off the colonial power, one of the first things the founders said was, we're going to guarantee freedom of speech, regardless of what your worldview is. They also said, we're not going to have a state religion. We're going to allow freedom of religion. This is who we are. And we have been that way for now 250 years, and I believe it is our essential nature and will continue to be. I believe people who came here who made this nation even greater came here because they were inspired in large measure by those values. So I think it's not changing in that way. I think there are threats to freedom of speech, unquestionably. But maybe because my parents were so deeply affected by the McCarthy period, I put things in perspective. The McCarthy period, in one way, was worse than anything we have experienced now. There was a denigration, a sort of degrading of our free speech rights and of the actual space in which people could be involved in their society that was radical and intense. And today, you could love Trump, love Biden, hate Biden, doesn't matter. We sure as hell can say all viewpoints are being intensely expressed. The lights are on, right? Like everything's alive and active. And there are threats to democracy, I'm the first to say it, but not because people fell asleep or because they were intimidated from being willing to speak up. In fact, once Trump came to power, people got more engaged in many ways. So I think freedom of speech is inherently American. It's who we are. Yes, there are threats to it, but do I think the vast majority of Americans want to protect their freedom of speech? Absolutely.
There's this John Stuart Mill quote that I won't get exactly right, but I'll paraphrase it. It really means a lot to me. And that is that the man that only knows his own opinion his own position doesn't even really know that. Would you agree with that sentiment?
I think there's truth in that. I hadn't heard that one before. I think there's truth in it. I mean, look, we're humans, so everything's comparative, but also we gain by comparison, unquestionably. It's a good way to make sure that our thinking actually aligns to our values. Whatever has built each of our values, we should be constantly asking ourselves, hey, am I being consistent here? Or have something changed? Is there new information? There's the famous, I'm sure remember when Stephen Colbert, in his previous character from his previous show, spoke at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and George W. Bush was there, and he, Colbert in that right-wing media persona was praising George W. Bush, but it had a second-level meaning, and he said, the great thing about President Bush is he believes on Wednesday exactly what he believed on Monday, regardless of what happened on Tuesday. And I think that is a sort of a window into what you're saying. You actually should care about what happened on Tuesday. And maybe what happened on Tuesday is going to cause you to rethink something.
Yeah.
I think your quote's a good quote because, look, I don't want to have philosophical comfort. I don't want to be someone who's like, oh, I have my worldview, it's set, nothing to see here. I don't care what happens, I'm sticking with it. I believe in my worldview, but I want it to stand the test of time. I want it to be challenged. I want to see if, new developments still prove it to be true, or if I have to modify something. There's a quote I heard, there's this, I don't know if you've seen this great, to me, great series on Netflix called Messiah. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it.
I've heard about this, I haven't seen it yet.
Strongly recommend. But the central character uses a quote, which I don't think at all they developed. I think they're borrowing it, but I think it's true. It says, if you seek truth, you may find comfort. If you seek comfort, you will never find truth. So to me, the philosophical equivalent is, if you just want to be comfortable in your own philosophy and feel good about yourself, you're not going to find truth. If you constantly seek truth, you may find your philosophy at times has to be modified, or you might question it, you might adjust it, or you might ratify it, but it will be much more meaningful.
You're reminding me of something that I don't have a deep understanding about, but I'm aware of in different conflict zones, these sort of commissions that have, in some cases, have been successful, sort of truth and reconciliation commissions, in which two sides that were warring, and you have this moment. I think maybe the most interesting example that people kind of forget about is the Northern Ireland, like that England was engaged in a Anglo-Irish terror bout for like most of our, like half my life, more than half of yours, perhaps. That's crazy. No one even remembers that in like younger generations. It almost sounds like ridiculous. There is something to be said, and I agree with you on this, for being heard. I think it's not logical. I think it's human that we want to be heard, feel heard, so that we can bring closure to something that hurts and move forward. And I think that my hope is that we can do both. And it feels to me like there's a lot of the being heard for past grievance and not enough of, okay, now let's start to move forward on a lot of fronts in America, and on the left and the right. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I think it's fantastic that you're raising the parallel of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. The Northern Ireland peace process is an incredibly good example. The process around South Africa, Rwanda. I mean, there's some. Colombia had an example of this. There's a lot to look at around the world that were much more difficult situations than what we're talking about here, bluntly. I mean, we have our problems in America, but you're talking about places where, hundreds of thousands of people died, or millions even. So I had a student at NYU who, her family was from Rwanda, and she spent a lot of time there, and we got talking about this very topic, and I said, her family was Tutsi. They were the victims of a lot of the genocide. And I said, well, how does that work now? And she said, well, everyone knows who died and who died at whose hands, and it's not like that history has been forgotten, but no one wants to go down that road again. And so that Truth and Reconciliation process allowed a reset where a sort of a human sensibility of, if not decency, of recognition of our shared fate came to the fore. And people made a very conscious decision, like as a whole community, as a whole nation, that they had to turn the page. That they didn't, the results would be devastating. And it's remarkable in all these places we've talked about, most of them certainly, and Northern Ireland is a great example. I mean, they have not gone back to that horrible time. They've really held and maybe gritted their teeth a lot of the time, but they still held. So I agree with you. I think we need to figure out, let's have the grievances on the table. It's the only way you make sense of things. But let's stay in the room together and then figure out where we go from here.
When I hear that America being depicted as one of the more racist places in this planet, I find that very, very strange, having traveled around beyond America, because surprising places have proven to be more overtly bigoted, including the Scandinavian countries, actually, than my experience of America, and especially America on a New York City subway car.
My favorite.
I happen to like. I was just in New York last June again for the Tribeca Film Festival. I took the subway every day, and I sent my son out to Queens on the subway that like one of the nights to go to a hip hop concert. He came back alive. I know there's problems, there's National Guard, there's crazy stuff going on, but it felt like the same New York to me. So I have a fairly nuanced view on that, even if I don't know if it's true or not. But how do you honestly think about America and our culture as it pertains to race? And obviously this is a loaded question for you. You have a mixed race family. You've put that on the foreground in your politics. But like, what's your opinion, America, from a perspective of race?
No, I appreciate your question because I would argue that I don't know the country that's not in the throes of a problem over race and ethnicity. It's not always race. You know, sometimes it is people who, to you and I, would look pretty similar. You know, we go back to Rwanda, you know, to a Westerner, you wouldn't necessarily see the difference between the two ethnicities that ended up being in the middle of a genocidal battle, right? And the same with Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
You know, could you tell a Catholic and a Protestant apart if they were walking down the street? You know, so I think we need to recognize that race, ethnicity, religion, obviously the conflicts all over the world between Sunni and Shia, you know, this is a human reality that must be confronted. Some progress has been made in some places, but very little in the scheme of world history. So we're fighting this battle still. And I think you can be a very loyal American and say we have a race problem that we have to address. And we have for centuries. And in fact, it's healthy to put it out in the open and keep working on it. You know, we are a country that has had an experimental nature from the beginning. You know, we talk about the American experiment. I think your analogy, your use of the example of the New York City subway is exactly right on. I have often made the point to people. I was feeling it just the other day when I was in the subway. You look around, people of all different faiths, all different ethnicities from all over the world, and they go about their business. It's a weird, peaceful coexistence, but it's still a peaceful coexistence. You know, people don't break out into fights. Every single day it works. And it's an example to the world. So
Every single day it
why
works
don't-
with an asterisk.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's not perfect. But, you know, it's like in a lot of places in the world, like I say, Sunni and Shia and other examples, you know, you walk down the wrong street or you end up in the wrong neighborhood and you instantly have a problem. Like in the subway in New York City, it's a given there's no majority. Like everyone has a piece of the pie and it keeps a balance.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point about New York City itself. There is no single majority population, racially or ethnically. It's split, you know, white, black, Latino, Asian. It's truly a mixed place, and that's a very healthy, positive thing. I think the point in all this is, if someone said America doesn't have a race problem, well, they haven't paid much attention to America and they haven't paid attention to our history. If someone says we have the worst problem anywhere in the world, they haven't paid much attention to the rest of the world. We do have a problem. We need to keep working on our problem. We've definitely made some progress. We definitely still have a problem. The more we put it out there and actually deal with it, the better off we're going to be. And by the way, the generations coming up are the least racist in history. I've spent so much time by virtue of my kids, but also well beyond now teaching. I have so much faith that the generations coming up now are going to help us heal a lot of these issues because they just don't see the world the same way. They don't see these biases. They don't carry them so deeply in their being as what predecessor generations had. So I think it's just great to, and again, to the American experiment, to who we've always been. We're supposed to be working on, you know, a more perfect union. Without the whole concept, it's so interesting. They didn't say, hey, we have a more perfect union. We're done here. There's a ongoing process inherent in our country's founding and its vision that we have to keep working on this, and that's part of the beauty of the situation.
Do you feel like a larger share of the voices we hear, and I think this is true on both the left and the right. So this is not a purely, you know, I think most people would probably look at my body of work and call me a right winger, and that's fine. but I think this is happening on all sides. A kind of nihilism about America that's taking hold. And I don't think it's just here. I think it's happening in a lot of places. So Tucker Carlson goes to Moscow and marvels that that there's cheaper food without taking into account that cheaper food isn't cheaper for Russians because their incomes are a quarter of ours. And says, this is our leadership is a failure because look, I can go into a Moscow grocery store and get cheap eggs. That's on the right. There's a sort of down on America on the right, and there's a America is rotten to the core, soaked in slavery, unrepentable on the left. Have those voices risen? Is it a function of our digital age that they seem so loud? Am I just like a Politico and so I'm hearing this all the time?
I think yes. I mean, the folks who are in the political world and the media world see our country differently than most of our fellow citizens, period.
I agree.
Most people are living life. Most people are living life. The aperture, the worldview is about neighborhood or town or community, their workplace, the place they worship, the school their kid goes to. It's not this big global perspective. And folks have some fundamental philosophical worldview, but they don't parse it and get into all the details the way people in the political world do. So that's one point. Two, the folks who have those more extreme critiques on left and right are a very small number. They're a really small number. They're very loud, and yes, social media has amplified their voices. And I think there's a certain reality, which, I don't happen to obviously agree with Donald Trump. I think it's fair to say his presence amplified a certain kind of speech, brought out a difference in approach that, undermined some of the norms that kept a little more balance in things. I don't think that's forever. But in the end, I don't honestly get lost in it because I think most Americans are proud to be Americans, period. It's an incredible country. It's a country that's not finished yet, by definition. We have some growing to do and some improving to do, but it's still an amazing place that people are proud of ultimately. There is an achievement or opportunity gap that's what we talked about earlier, that I do think older generations are worried about what's going to happen for their younger folks, and younger generations are less hopeful about the future. But that's because of COVID. That's because of globalization. That's because of a lot of things that did structurally change over time that we need to address. They're not forever. So, classic question. If you ask most Americans, would you rather live here or, choose the other country and you can go there now, most people are going to want to live here, period.
I think our border tells that story pretty viscerally.
100%. 100%. People could leave if they wanted to leave. That's another great thing about America. We don't force people to stay. And you don't see, even in countries that are accepting immigrants from elsewhere, you don't see people flocking out. So let's kind of take it down a notch, as Dante likes to tell me on more than one occasion, take it down a notch, Dad. It's like, why don't we accept that in the end, most people are actually proud Americans and not filled with hate and not wildly ideological. And we have problems, and we also have the ability to address them. Bill Clinton had his ups and downs, but I always appreciated the simple formula he put out there when he said there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what's right with America. I think that's absolutely right.
We could go so much longer. And I hope we can have another conversation like this and keep it going.
Only if you give me a roast pork sandwich. That needs to be catered.
That's right.
I'm going to put that in the contract next time. I will give you ample time if there's a roast pork sandwich from South Philly.
It's got to be sharp provolone and broccoli rabe with a little bit of pepper flakes.
Yes. Yes. Sign me up.
I asked this, Mr. Mayor, I asked this of every guest we have on the show, and obviously we've talked about a lot of things today. And there's things we haven't talked about that I will acknowledge. if we put this out in its entirety, I will have people say, how dare you have Mayor de Blasio on and not talk about COVID and COVID policy? And I'm just going to acknowledge we haven't talked about that. And there was too much else to talk about. So that might be our next conversation, maybe, but I'm just going to bracket that off. This show's called Dad Saves America because I believe that dads, as men, that our role as fathers is perhaps the most heroic thing we can do, not just for our family, but for the community that we're embedded in and for the country as a whole. I think you share that view. How do you see your role in the American story as a father, as a politician, and as an American?
Well, the best thing I ever did was to have two wonderful children. I mean, it's absolutely the centerpiece of my entire life. And, I love them so deeply I can't even describe it. And anytime I'm with them, anytime I talk to them, that's like the most important thing that happened that day. So I think the way it plays out is if we're loving fathers, good fathers, attentive fathers, responsible fathers, that is the number one contribution we make. Both because these are the people we're responsible for first and foremost, but also because we're providing the values of the future by what we do. Charlene always had the very simple message to me on so many things as you have to navigate in marriage. And she would always say, don't tell me, show me. And, I think parents, fathers in particular, because let's face it, a lot of fathers didn't step up. A lot of fathers didn't show up. I mean, my dad, because of tragedy, certainly that was part of it, but my dad was not around. My dad did not contribute for most of my upbringing, didn't contribute economically. My mom had to carry the whole load. That's a very common story, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. So I'd say the first thing we have to say about dads is show up, take responsibility, do your share, live up to who you are as a father. Or if you don't want to do those things, you might want to think about not becoming a father, So, but when you become a father and you do it right, you are contributing to the community, you are contributing to the nation, because by example, you're not only taking care of the people in front of you who you should take care of, but you're also showing them how to be good members of the community and how to take care of the next generation. Nothing more important than that.
Thank you for being on Dad Saves America. It's been a pleasure.
You're okay with me. I don't care what they say about you. You're okay with me.
I've warmed up to you, Bill. So, it's for what it's worth.
We'll take it. We're doing good. We're going to be an example to America.
We're making some progress.